John, why don't we start with you?
Okay. Hello, this is Patricia Vercelli. Good morning.
Good morning. I can hear you fine. Fran?
You're on mute, Fran.
This is Fran Smith. Am I still on mute?
No,
Nope.
we can hear you. But if is there a way for you to increase your volume to be a little bit louder or closer to the mic?
Okay, let me do that. All right. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Mario?
Mario here, can you hear me?
Yes, very
Very
clearly.
Hey, it's Chris. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Chris. Okay. And then Paul, I'm going to ask, could you hear all of us, Paul?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask all of the attendees to turn their camera off and to also mute yourselves unless you have questions, and then you can use the raise hand feature or the chat. But I want to make sure everybody can see the four ACPAC members. So we'll wait about 5 minutes or so before we get started. Morning, Judy.
Morning, Judy.
Morning, Blaine.
Morning, Blaine.
So I hear echo, and it's probably because people have not muted themselves. So if you are not an ACPAC member, please mute your microphone. Let's see if this works better. Great. Okay.
Great. Hey, Blaine. It's
Hi,
Charlie.
Hi, Charlie.
You're
Good morning. Good to see
I
you.
love the new hairdo. I don't know when you got it done, but you're looking great.
Thank you. Yeah, I figured it was time for a change. I appreciate it.
Perfect.
Charlie, because we have a lot of attendees, I'm asking everyone who is not an ACPAC member to mute and also to turn your cameras off unless you are asking a question, and I'll go over some of the rules in a few minutes. Hi, Maureen. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Did you say camera off and unmute?
Yes, I did. And I'll repeat. I know I actually would like to see everyone, but for now, I'm going to ask everyone to mute and turn your camera off unless you are an ACPAC member. And we're still having folks join, so we're going to wait a few minutes.
It is on.
So Charlie, if you're looking for it, there should be a bar, and the first one, at least on mine, says right next to the recording says camera off. Do you see it? Perfect. Okay. Thanks, Charlie. Hi, Lisa. So for those of you who are joining us, I'm asking everyone who is not a member of the committee to please mute yourselves and to turn the camera off. It's too bad we're not doing this in person. I see so many people I haven't talked to in a while on the on the list here. So I know it's past 9:30, but I'm seeing that folks are still joining, so I'm going to wait again for a few minutes. Okay, Stuart, that looks like it's everyone. Do you see anybody else at the lobby?
No, no one's currently in the lobby.
Okay, well then let's go ahead and get started. So let me start by saying if you are not an ACPAC member, if you're not a committee member, to please turn your cameras off and to please go ahead and mute yourself. Well, let's get started. Welcome to the virtual meeting of the Aviation Consumer Protection Advisory Committee, also known as the ACPAC. My name is Blaine Workey. I am the Assistant General Counsel for the Department's Office of Aviation Consumer Protection. I am also the designated federal official, or DFO, for this advisory committee. This committee, as you can see from the video, has 4 members. It's tasked with evaluating the department's aviation consumer protection program and providing recommendations to the secretary on how to improve the program or establish additional programs if needed. Congress requires that the ACPAC consist of 4 members, 1 each from the airlines, airports, state and local government, as well as a nonprofit public interest group with expertise in consumer protection. Secretary Chow has recently selected Chris Carr, who is the Attorney General from Georgia, to serve not only as the state and local government representative, but also as the chair of this committee. We also have Fran Smith, who is an adjunct fellow with Competitive Enterprise Institute as a consumer representative. Patricia Vercelli, who is the general counsel for Airlines for America, who serves as the airline representative. And Mario Rodriguez is the executive director of the Indianapolis Airport Authority, and is serving as a representative of airport operators. Now, these members were selected because of their expertise in the particular functions of the committee, as well as their representativeness. Now, before I ask each of the committee members to provide you a little bit more information about their background and their interests in consumers and consumer protection, I'm going to deviate from the agenda slightly. I want to recognize the unprecedented impact that the COVID-19 public health emergency had on air travel. Over the past 6 months, we have seen significant schedule changes, airline schedule changes and operations. The department has also received a high volume of consumer complaints related to the COVID-19 public health emergency. I want to assure all of you that the department is here and working on these issues. Many of us at the Department of Transportation have been actively involved in the federal government's response to the spread and the impact of the coronavirus since early this year. And we're working to address a myriad of issues related to the COVID-19 public health emergency. Now, because the purpose of today's meeting is to discuss 3 issues. It's to discuss in-flight sexual misconduct, the transparency of airline ancillary fees, and involuntary changes to passenger itineraries. Because the purpose, again, is to discuss these 3 issues, we will not be discussing consumer matters related to the COVID-19 public health emergency unless they specifically relate to one of these 3 issues. Now, if there is interest in discussing this matter, certainly it can be a topic for the future ACPAC meeting. The attendees should contact their representative, airlines, for the airlines, the consumers, consumer groups, and so forth, if they would, to identify topics that they may want to discuss at future ACPAC meetings. And I think at this point, I will turn the meeting over to the committee members. So again, they can talk with you a little bit and share with you some of their interests and background and expertise, starting with our new chair, Chris Carr, Attorney General for Georgia. Chris?
Blaine, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It is great to be with you. Blaine, thank you for your hard work in getting us here to this point. I know this meeting's been delayed a couple of times, and so appreciate all of your hard work and that of my fellow colleagues on ACPAC. I want to thank the Secretary for appointing me to ACPAC. It's a tremendous honor to be asked to join, and I'm excited to be on the committee. I spent a little bit of time on the Hill as the chief of staff to one of Georgia's senators, Johnny Isakson. So having had some experience working with him on the Finance Committee and the Commerce Committee, and some of the issues that may be of importance to those that are on today, as well as to our fellow members. I was the commissioner of the Georgia Department of Economic Development for 3 years, and now the Attorney General for the state of Georgia. And consumer protection is one of the big issues that we deal with, ensuring that we protect the interests of the people of our state, as well as businesses that are doing it the right way. So it's an honor to be able to join. I look forward to working on these 3 important issues to advise the Secretary as well as the department, and appreciate being with everybody today. Thanks, Blaine.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Fran? Fran, you are on mute. That's correct. Yes.
Fran Smith, I'm an adjunct fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and I served on the committee through 2019 and then this year as well. I come from originally a financial services background, where I also ran a consumer education foundation to provide information. I then 12 years with a panoply of issues ranging from food choices through transportation issues. I also served a U.S. Trade Representative Trade Policy Advisory Committee for 10 years. And we dealt again with a range of issues there. I was very pleased to be asked to join ACPAC because I think the diversity of the consumer gives me some ability to look at these issues maybe with some fresh eyes. My goal in consumer matters is to help consumers make the decisions that are right for them, and not to have a one-size-fits-all. And that is also something that I feel very strongly about. Also looking at unintended consequences of actions when markets are emerging, and trying to freeze the market at a certain point can not help consumers. So those are some of the ways I approach the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. That was helpful. Patricia?
Sure. Hi, I'm Patricia Bercelli, and I am the General Counsel for Airlines for America. I have been in the aviation industry for around 20 years, came from the distribution side of the airlines, passionate about this industry, a daughter of a former pilot. So this has been in my blood my whole life. It was an honor to join the ACPAC because I think it's a phenomenal forum to exchange information for our industry, to also hear from consumers. And obviously we are in a complex industry. I think it's behooves us as members of this industry to be able to explain more about how and what is it that we do that is not always clear to people. It is like I said, complex industry. It's fiercely competitive. I was thinking how around this time last year we were celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Airline Deregulation Act, and talking about how it was really the era of accessibility, because so many people could now fly, U.S. citizens, but also around the world, could have accessibility to flying now. I also, it's interesting to echo your comments, Blaine, about what a different world, we're living in right now, and the changes that we have seen. We had this meeting originally on April 4th of 2019, and at that time, there were over 2.3 million passengers that flew out of U.S. airports on that day. On that same day this year, that number dropped down 94% to 124,000 passengers. So you can tell you the magnitude of this pandemic that we're all going through, we're all suffering through. At the beginning of this year, we also were talking about how we switched from really the age of accessibility to what is really a miracle in aviation. And I think you all hopefully can agree that this industry, during this COVID crisis has been an instrumental component of our society, but also, our crews have put on their uniforms every day to fly not only medical personnel, but have converted passenger planes into cargo planes to carry PPE and other very essential needs, even to the hot zones. That has put a tremendous strain, obviously, on the industry. On October 1st, we risk losing up to 100,000 of our employees, which is going to create even more of a strain, both on resources, but also on the timing of implementing new initiatives, for example. And so it is more important now than ever, that there is understanding, obviously, about these constraints, but also to, as this committee reviews different approaches that we might take, to make sure that if there is no market failure, that we are allowing for competition so that there is innovation, because our airlines are going to have to compete more than ever when we come out of this pandemic. So anyway, it's a pleasure being here. Blaine, to you and your team, I know this has been a long process, as AG Carr has stated, and it's been an honor to work with you, the team, but also my fellow panelists on the committee. So we're looking forward to a great day today. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Mario?
Well, it's an honor to be here with all of you. Thank you, Blaine. And it is an honor to be on the panel and represent the airports. Thank you to the secretary for appointing me. I've been in this business for over 30 years in this wonderful industry that's ever changing. And it seems like nowadays, during this pandemic, we're in for incredible transformative time. And I echo what Patricia said, that it's going to be a long, dark tunnel. There's light at the end of the tunnel, but it's going to be very difficult to bring the industry back in a very, very feasible way in the future. It's going to be transformed. Our lives are going to be transformed. But that shouldn't restrict our focus on the customer, which is extremely important to us. Over and over again, we've won. Right now, I'm the executive director of the Indianapolis Airport Authority, as you said, Blaine, and we've won awards after awards. We were just awarded the J.D. Power and Associates. Well, it's not J.D. Power and Associates anymore. It's just J.D. Power's award for best mid-size airport in the United States, which is quite an honor. So our focus is always on the customer, always on our partners, always on making sure we deliver public value. And our partners, our main partners, obviously, are the airlines, which underpin the economy of this nation. And it's incredibly important to keep every airline viable during this really, really harsh time that we're going to go through, and keep them viable to make sure the United States is viable. I think, there's a couple of numbers that stick in my head, which are incredible numbers. The United States aviation industry moved over 1 billion passengers in 2019, which is phenomenal. Worldwide, it moved over 9 billion. First of all, it has to be viable because it's part of our national transportation system. And secondly, and most importantly, there's no alternative. There's actually no alternative to aviation, where no one's going to hop on a transatlantic steamer and go across the pond. No one is going to bring back massive transportation trains. That's not going to happen. We need to keep our transportation system viable. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening to me.
Okay, thank you, Mario. Well, now that you all know a little bit more about the ACPAC members, I would like to go over a few housekeeping matters before we hear from the speaker, our next speaker, Judy Coletta. For the benefit of all the attendees and participants, I'm going to request that everyone keep in mind some guidelines that I'm going to mention. First, I wanted to let you know again that there will be a morning and afternoon session with a 1-hour break for lunch at noon. So hopefully everyone has a copy of the agenda. In the morning session, the committee will discuss and deliberate on the report that they have received from the National In-Flight Sexual Misconduct Task Force. In the afternoon, the committee will address the information and recommendations that it heard and received from the speakers concerning transparency of airline ancillary fees, as well as involuntary changes to passenger itineraries. We ask again that the attendees turn off their microphone and their cameras. The ACPAC members will go ahead and keep their cameras on throughout the day. We also will have the speakers turn on their cameras and their microphone when they are presenting. Members of the public can ask questions by using the chat feature in Teams. So you can go ahead and type your question, and hopefully we'll have time to take questions, and we'll have a DOT staff member read your questions. If you are not familiar or comfortable using the chat, you can also send an email to the department at ACPAC. It's ACPAC @dot.gov. This email will be monitored throughout the day. So again, as time permits, we will take questions. Written comments may also be submitted to the docket. It's www.regulations.gov. The docket number for this advisory committee is DOT-OST-2018-0190. So if you experience technical difficulties during this virtual meeting, you can also reach out to the department through that same email address, which is ACPAC @dot.gov. And I appreciate everyone's participation and patience as we work through our first virtual ACPAC meeting. Thank you. So now we will hear from Judy Coletta, who is the Deputy General Counsel for the U.S. Department of Transportation. Judy was also the chair and did an excellent job of ensuring that we had a good report to the ACPAC. She was the chair for the National In-Flight Sexual Misconduct Task Force. Judy?
Good morning. Thank you, Blaine. And thank you, AG Carr, Ms. Smith, Ms. Vercelli, and Mr. Rodriguez for your service on the ACPAC and for the opportunity to speak with you today. As Blaine said, I'm Judy Coletta. I'm the department's Deputy General Counsel, and I served as chair of the National In-Flight Sexual Misconduct Task Force established by Secretary of Transportation Elaine Chao on February 11th, 2019. I want to talk to you today about why the task force was established, how the committee worked, how did we get to this report, and some of our thoughts about the findings and recommendations that we did made. The task force was established really in response to three different things. There was the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018, the Joint Explanatory Statement of the Transportation, Housing and Urban Development and Related Agencies Appropriations Act for fiscal year 2018. I'm just going to refer to that going forward as the joint statement. And in furtherance of the department's aviation consumer protection responsibilities. In the joint statement, Congress expressed concern about the adequacy of response to incidents of sexual assault and sexual harassment that takes place on board airplanes. Congress noted that there's some limited data on the prevalence of incidents of sexual assault and sexual harassment, maybe a lack of guidance and training for airline personnel to respond to such incidents, and it requested the establishment of a task force to provide recommendations on best practices for air carriers related to training, reporting, and data collection. Subsequent to that, there was the FAA Reauthorization Act in later that year in October of 2018 that expressed a sense of Congress that airlines should have policies and procedures in place to address sexual misconduct. And those were policies and procedures relating to reporting incidents to law enforcement, informing passengers and employees of their rights, and training employees on responding to sexual misconduct. The act itself did call for the establishment of the task force and provided certain protocols for that. So Secretary Chow established the task force and appointed a number of representatives of different interests. It included representatives from the federal government. The Department of Transportation was represented. From the Department of Justice, there was the FBI, there was the Office on Violence Against Women, and the Office for Victims of Crime. There were also representatives of state and local law enforcement agencies, a national organization specializing in providing services to sexual assault victims, a national travel organization, labor organizations representing flight attendants and pilots. And the task force also included individuals representing the interests of consumers. Fran was a member of the task force as well as a member of ACPAC. There was representatives of airports and air carriers. Secretary Chow charged the task force with reviewing and evaluating existing ways for passengers involved in incidents of sexual misconduct by other passengers on board aircraft to report such allegations to the carrier. We were charged with reviewing and evaluating carriers' existing training protocols and identifying best practices to address incidents of sexual misconduct on board the airplane. We were charged with reviewing and evaluating existing reporting protocols and identifying best practices for air carriers to timely report or to facilitate the timely reporting of incidents of sexual misconduct by passengers to law enforcement and trying to ensure the privacy protections for the persons who are subject to the sexual misconduct. We were also charged with reviewing and evaluating air carriers' existing data practices, if any, and identifying effective methods to collect, maintain, and make publicly available data on incidents of sexual misconduct by passengers. Another thing we looked at and were tasked with doing was reviewing and utilizing the first-hand accounts from passengers who experienced sexual misconduct on board aircraft and reviewing air carrier practices addressing incidents of sexual misconduct. So you received this report. It's a hefty report of 72 pages with its appendices. We transmitted it to you in March of 2020. And this report provides information on existing practices on reporting, on data collection, on training on responding to and addressing allegations of in-flight sexual misconduct. It addresses highlights of aspects of awareness, reporting, and data collection that are suitable for enhancement. And it makes recommendations on actions that could be taken by the federal government, by law enforcement agencies, airlines, airports, and unions. You're going to have an opportunity later this morning to hear the details on the findings and recommendations of the task force. But I thought it was important to let you know, how did we get here? And as the committee first got together, and I led the committee, or the task force, it was, for me, thinking of the parable of the blind men and the elephant. There's the story goes, a group of blind men came upon the elephant, and depending on what part of the elephant the men touched, that informed their thoughts on what they were dealing with. And in some ways, bringing together people, as we did on our task force, with all the different perspectives and experiences that they had, helped us to ensure that we can see as much about this issue that we could to address the issue of sexual misconduct on board aircraft. So how did we work? Diligently, let me tell you that. We took the charge from Secretary Chow very seriously. Members dedicated their time not only in the meetings that we had, but apart from those meetings to bring necessary data and information to the table. We listened to firsthand accounts from passengers and from flight attendants who experience in-flight sexual misconduct. We heard about the actions that airlines and law enforcement had taken in response to such incidents. We reviewed complaints that were filed with the department. We considered the results of airline and airport surveys. I mean, I cannot thank enough the work that each member of the task force contributed to the efforts of the task force. There was the time, the attention to detail, the statistical analysis of those things. We didn't want to look at one area and see only one part of the problem. We wanted to understand really what is the nature of the situation and what would be the best efforts going forward to address sexual misconduct. We listened to the perspectives of the consumers. We listened to the labor unions. We listened to providers of victims service providers and experts on training to address sexual violence and sexual harassment. We carefully analyzed this information, and it was really that kind of dedication and through the months of meetings and information sharing and data collection that we were able to develop this report. We had an initial organizational meeting where we really got to understand about each other and the perspectives we would bring to the table. We met in June. We met 2 days in, well, we first met in May. We met 2 days in June. We met again in July, 2 days in September. Then we had teleconferences in October, November, actually our first foray into using this kind of software to have a virtual meeting. But we appreciated and valued the time and commitment that each of the members made and tried to use their time wisely. I want to talk about the listening sessions, because one of the things that we were specifically charged to do was to get the perspective of survivors of sexual misconduct. And as you see in our report, as we introduced each section, we wanted to give you a flavor of how we took those stories, their perspectives, their experiences into account in terms of making findings and recommendations. And I'm just going to talk about one of the women who talked to us, who spoke from a prepared statement describing how she took a overnight flight, a 9-hour flight, because that was part of her job. She did it frequently. She was a regular traveler. She was a comfortable traveler, appreciated the opportunity to fly, to get to destinations, and frequently told us she slept on the planes because it was the best use of her time to get from one place to another. And on this flight, she awoke in the middle of the night to somebody who was repeatedly grabbing at her crotch. And she said her immediate response was to yell no and to slap his hand, and how she got up from her seat and went to the back of the plane to alert the flight attendants. And she said at that time the flight attendants shared their own stories with her about sexual misconduct that they had experienced. She said she knew she couldn't go back to her seat. She needed someone to collect her belongings. She wanted to be reseated elsewhere. And she said how as she experienced this, she repeated her experience on that plane to multiple crew members over a 30-minute period. There was a little confusion because the flight manifest seemed to indicate that she was supposed to be seated next to a minor. She was ultimately reseated, she told us. And she says, But upon approach to her destination, she was asked to return to her original seat, and she refused to do that. When the plane landed, she said she just had to quickly get off and catch a connecting flight. Several days later, she followed up with the airline, and she told us the airline's response was to credit her frequent flyer account with some bonus miles. She was told that she could file a report with authorities, and if she couldn't do that, a police report would be filed on her behalf. Several weeks later, because she was returning from a business trip, she followed up with the airline again and learned that the incident had been marked closed with no report having been filed. A month later, she self-reported the incident to the FBI and met with the FBI representatives. She said it was a difficult experience. They conducted, working with the FBI, there was a year-long investigation, but they had problems identifying who the passenger was and that the case was ultimately closed. We heard several stories from a variety of passengers who had experienced sexual misconduct. We also read the reports that they had filed with the Department of Transportation. But we also looked at a variety of other things. We contacted the airlines to get their perspective on what they do with regard to training, with regard to how they train their crew to deal with both the reporting of sexual misconduct by a passenger to them, and then how the crew makes those reports potentially to law enforcement. So we looked at the statistics behind the issue of sexual misconduct on airplanes. We heard from our representative from the FBI in terms of the FBI statistics. The FBI talked about, in 2017, there were 63 incidents that were reported. In 2018, there were 84. In 2019, 119. They didn't have confidence. I mean, when the task force heard these numbers, it became a question of, is this a problem that is rising? Is this something that is increasing over time? And yet, when we delved a little further, it was a question of there may not be confidence behind those numbers in terms of a particular increase. DOT provided numbers as well in terms of complaints that had been made to the department as it began to assess incidents of sexual misconduct because of the prevalence of the issue that we were hearing in the press. And the numbers were 17 complaints in 2017, 14 in 2018, and 10 in 2019. When we talked from a statistical perspective, we talked about how does one determine the extent of a problem based on these kinds of reporting numbers? Are there other things that we should look at? Are there surveys that should be done? How do we assess the nature of this situation? And as we looked at those statistics and we were informed by the experiences of people who had experienced sexual misconduct, we struggled with how do you make recommendations? How detailed should recommendations be? Should recommendations be to require airlines and airports to do something to address this problem? We struggled with issues on awareness. Do people really understand that it is something that is considered a crime and is reportable? Well, I've talked about looking at this and everybody bringing in different perspectives. The lawyers were very comfortable with the legal definitions of what is a sexual assault or what is a physical touching. Everybody on the committee didn't share that same comfort. it became a question of, are we really addressing this situation by coming up with a legalistic definition? Should we have a broad definition that for the passengers will be a law enforcement in terms of taking action? But if we come up with a broad definition, is that the best approach in terms of bringing awareness to this situation? And with awareness, we felt that reporting and data collection and training would be enhanced because people would be more aware of a situation, how to report. It's a question of how the airlines would assess this information based on that. And so in presenting its report that we did in March of 2020, as I've said before, it highlights the aspects of awareness, reporting, data collection, and training that the task force felt were suitable for enhancement and development, and it makes them those specific recommendations. The task force asks that the ACPAC consider this report in making recommendations to the Secretary. The task force is confident that the report and adoption of its recommendations will lead to enhanced awareness, better reporting practices, data collection and training, and thereby that will improve the response to incidents that do take place. And we felt over time that that would actually reduce incidents of in-flight sexual misconduct. And the task force really looked at this and said, as we went through this process, that although the report is focused on passengers, we also did hear from flight attendants. And the task force expects that the implementation of these types of recommendations may also improve responses to reduce sexual misconduct experienced by flight attendants and reduce the incidents generally. So again, as I said, we feel that the adoption of the recommendations will lead to enhanced awareness and improve the responses. Thanks for the opportunity to talk with you today. I hope you have a better understanding of how we reach the recommendations and findings that are included in our report. I wish you well in your deliberations, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Can I ask all of the attendees to please mute your microphones? Thank you. Thank you, Judy. That was a very good explanation of the process that the task force used, as well as summary of the key points. I will open it up for the ACPAC members. If they have any questions for Judy, any general questions, we will be talking about the specific elements of the report later on this morning.
Judy, I'll just make an overall comment first and foremost. I just want to thank you and commend you for your leadership, because I know how extensively you all looked at all the issues. And I have to say, you know, when we received the report and it was some 70-some pages long, I thought, well, this is going to be a difficult report to digest. But I have to say, the way that you presented the issues with the task force to reach to the recommendations, it was phenomenally done. I mean, as you know, the airlines, we always say, you know, that safety of our passengers and our crew are #1 priority. And we recognize that there has been issues, obviously, over the years. They have been heightened with the Me Too movement in terms of people coming forward. And I know that, you know, ever since, you know, obviously the Reauthorization Act, the joint statement also, that airlines have been looking at this. A lot of since you made these, had these meetings and had this report. So it's been wonderful to see that there have been already many changes implemented, from training to awareness and what have you. So I just wanted just to make the general comment to thank you, because I think your work was tremendous to help us all in this endeavor.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Appreciate that.
We
couldn't have done it without everybody's participation.
Okay, this is Fran. I'd like to reiterate those comments. I served on the task force, and not only the all-day meetings, the testifying by some of the victims, the conference calls that would last 3 hours, the review of the documents, preliminary documents, I don't know how many iterations task force members reviewed very carefully, suggested changes, suggested additions, more information. So it was a tremendous effort involving huge numbers of people on a conference call that I think at sometimes, Judy, it seemed like there were 100 people there, but I think it didn't quite reach that number. But it was a tremendous effort. DOT personnel had to pull together comments from all of the task force members, comments on the papers, comments in the conference calls, at the meetings, and pull it together in a coherent, concise form. And I commend them for doing a stupendous job. Thank you.
Thanks, Fran.
Thank you. And
I'm sorry, from the advisory committee members on their thoughts on the task force recommendation. Jessica?
Good morning, everybody. As Blaine said, my name is Jessica Illich, and I'm the Director of Consumer Advocacy in the Office of Aviation Consumer Protection. And at this time, I'm going to discuss the portion of the report that addresses defining sexual misconduct. Sexual misconduct is not defined by the FAA Reauthorization Act. In crafting the definition, the task force looked at existing criminal statutes and definitions used by airlines and organizations that provide services to sexual assault victims. The task force crafted and proposed a definition, which is, sexual misconduct is a broad term. It encompasses any behavior or attempted behavior of a sexual nature that is committed without consent or with someone incapable of consent, or by force, intimidation, coercion, or manipulation. Sexual misconduct also includes physical or verbal advances or harassment of a sexual nature, or public indecent exposure. The task force made 2 recommendations for defining sexual misconduct. The task force believes that a standardized definition will facilitate better data collection, reporting, and training within the airline industry. Therefore, the recommendation is for airlines to incorporate the task force definition of sexual misconduct. The task force also encourages law enforcement who responds to reported incidents of in-flight misconduct to be made aware of the task force definition. And this concludes the presentation of defining sexual misconduct.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jessica. If we could hear from the ACPAC members about any thoughts they may have on the definition that the task force is recommending be adopted for sexual misconduct.
This is Fran. I think it's very important that it's broader that includes verbal, etc., be incorporated into the overall. Otherwise, we have just the physical, which is horrible in itself, but people can be subjected to jokes, rude comments, indecent comments that make them very, very uncomfortable and really are should be included under sexual misconduct. So I like the broad definition and the fact that if it is adopted by various airlines in terms of including it in their publications, their information. If it gets adopted by law enforcement agencies along the line, that's not something that could happen right now. But I think it would make, it also would contribute to public awareness. If somebody doesn't get physically assaulted on an airline, they may feel like, well, that's not really sexual misconduct. And I think this can help create awareness that sexual overtures that are not necessarily physical come under this rubric. So I think it's a very good idea.
Thank you for that comment, Fran. And just to kind of highlight what Fran has said, the difference in the definition for sexual, there is a difference of a definition of sexual assault and sexual misconduct. The task force definition for sexual misconduct specifies that it would include acts that were committed by force, intimidation, coercion, or manipulation. So it wouldn't be necessarily any comment, but it could be behavior of a sexual nature that is committed again without consent or by force, intimidation, coercion, or manipulation. So it sounds like Fran is saying that she agrees with the task force broad definition. Do other ACPAC members have thoughts on this?
I agree with the definition. There is one thought that you may want to keep in the back of your mind is how do you disseminate this information down to the airports? While you have larger airports like us, New York, New Jersey Port Authority, and LAX, et cetera, that have very, very professional policing staff, for lack of a better term. There are very small municipalities that contract out for this type of service, for LEO services, law enforcement service. You may want to wish to come up with some way to disseminate that information and procedures down to those smaller markets that airlines have that fly into.
That's a very good point, Mario, and I'm going to save that comment so when we talk about awareness, we can talk about awareness for law enforcement as well. With regard to the definition, I know that the ACPAC members are already aware of this, but I'm just going to recap the two main recommendations from the task force on this. Did you want?
Yeah, let me just, before we do that, before you recap, if you don't mind, because I do, from the airline perspective, obviously, Fran, thank you for bringing those comments up because it makes absolute sense in terms of the broader definition. One of the things that I was looking at in terms of what the broad term would encompass that the task force talked about was, and I'll read just from here, from Judy's document, which is that the definition has to be broad for the purpose of deterring passengers from committing acts of sexual misconduct, but narrow enough for the purpose of collecting consistent data. To that effect, what I wanted to sort of talk with my fellow committee members was in striking that balance and talking a little bit about what Judy had explained, how the lawyers knew what these definitions meant, but were trying to make them user-friendly for the crews to understand, is when we get into this issue of behavior that occurred versus attempted behavior. And I know there was some discussion within the task force about these two components. And I just throw it out there in terms of, if we do include, attempted behavior, do we open ourselves up for getting away from this narrowly focused definition that can create consistency versus, having a catch-all where, obviously we have seen through these issues, it's in the eyes of the beholder, right? And so is it attempted based on how the victim feels about it? Is it how the flight attendant sees it? So I'll just throw it out there, and maybe, if the committee wouldn't mind discussing this a little bit more, if you gave some thought to this piece of attempted behavior. And AG Carr, not to put you on the spot, but
no, I was just about to weigh in.
I'm kind of thinking about you because I sort of think as lawyers we know once this is reported and then the FBI or the authorities look at this, obviously they can then parse through the legal definitions. But I just sort of wonder, have you seen in sort of policy decisions like broader like this where it confuses people by putting attempted?
Well, it's a great point, and in a great lawyerly way, I will say, it cuts both ways. It can make it more challenging. On the one hand, we've seen, and we don't, district attorneys are the tip of the spear on most felonies and misdemeanors in the state of Georgia. We have certain carve-outs, but in those areas that we do, when you talk about attempted X or attempted Y, that gets a little bit murkier. If the purpose is for data collection and clarity, it might make more sense to say behavior, because to your point, I think it then becomes in the eye of the beholder a little bit more. So on the flip side, there are those that attempt to commit a crime, and we do have attempted, robbery and others that are in the criminal code as well. I think the question comes back to what is the purpose of the definition and where are we trying to go with it? And I do think if you say any behavior, it provides a bit more clarity than attempted behavior. That being said, I also defer to the other members of the committee as well.
Chris, just to answer your question in terms of what the task force report states, the task force report with regard to the definition states that the purpose is to enable airlines to use it for training, data collection, reporting, as well and reporting. So it really is to use it in all three areas. Fran, were you going to say something?
No, I'm just checking, looking at some of the findings. Sure, yeah.
So to break out to the sexual misconduct definition, I'm just going to divide it in different elements just to make sure that the ACPAC members have an opportunity to discuss. One of it is, as Patricia pointed out, it covers both behavior and attempted behavior. A second component of the definition is that it captures not only behavior or attempted behavior of a sexual nature that is committed without consent, but it also covers situations where the individual is incapable of giving consent, or as Fran was mentioning earlier, by force, intimidation, coercion, or manipulation. So behavior and attempted behavior without consent, incapable of consent, and by force, intimidation, coercion, and manipulation. So Patricia and AG Carr have shared their thoughts on attempt. Mario or Fran, do you have any thoughts you would like to share on that?
Well, I was just rereading the definition, and I think the comments about do we need the attempted behavior, in looking at it, it would read it encompasses any behavior of a sexual nature that's committed without consent, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems to me that any behavior would incorporate attempted behavior. I don't see that adds to it. I agree with Patricia.
Yeah, I agree with Patricia also. It depends on what the behavior is, and an attempt, a certain behavior, even an attempt of a certain behavior should be, should fall into this definition.
Yeah.
Also, it's, lacking any sort of uniformity. This gives, even, let's say it's not perfect. Let's say it's not perfect. It gives the ability for the industry to make incremental moves forward and make things better and better and refine the definition as time goes on. So, this is a great start. Let's say it's imperfect. We make incremental moves forward.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was my only comment. Other than that, Blaine, definition is, I think it's excellent.
Okay.
And Blaine, can I ask one question too on the recommendation, the second recommendation, which kind of goes to what Mario was asking. It says the task force encourages law enforcement responding to reported incidents of in-flight misconduct to be made aware of the task force's definition. And we may want to wait. I wanted to clarify either with Jessica or with you. Is because the FBI has jurisdiction over special aircraft with that definition, does that mean whether you're in the air or on the ground, as long as you are on an airplane, then generally speaking, the FBI has jurisdiction? Probably more nuanced, but can somebody, because to Mario's point, if not, and if you're on the ground, it's local law enforcement, yeah, there's a broader group that we need to be aware that we need to get that information to local law enforcement, sheriffs, police departments, airport police, whatever it may be. If generally speaking, it's the FBI, then it's more FBI, U.S. Attorney's Office. Can somebody kind of clarify how that works practically?
Sure. The task force actually did spend some time talking about the jurisdiction.
Yeah, it's on page 6. So I'm looking at that.
Right. So I will Thank you for the page number. So I will quickly recap in terms of where there are concurrent jurisdiction and where the FBI has sole jurisdiction, and also certain instances where it may be a law enforcement in a different country that has the jurisdiction. So let's assume there is a flight in California between two cities in California. In that situation, not only will the FBI have jurisdiction, but law enforcement would also have jurisdiction. So there's concurrent jurisdiction in those instances.
Yep.
And there would need to be decisions made between law enforcement and FBI as to who is going to be the primary. But there are also situations, if you look on page 6, which talks about, let's see, if it's an aircraft that is operated by a U.S. carrier, regardless of where the operation takes place, once the aircraft door is closed, until basically the aircraft door is open and passengers are allowed to deplane, then at that point, then the FBI does have jurisdiction. Now, I mentioned it gets to be a little bit complicated when it's international travel. So if a U.S. carrier, for example, is going to flying to a foreign destination, even in instances where the FBI has jurisdiction, it's difficult to gather all of the evidence and all of the information that's necessary for the U.S. Attorney's Office to prosecute such a case. So, but in any event, if the incident occurs on a U.S. carrier arriving at a foreign airport, then the local law enforcement, which would be the foreign law enforcement, would be the first to respond. So they would be the ones that are going to be gathering the information. But if it's an aircraft, so if it's a U.S. carrier, the FBI, even when they'll have jurisdiction, but if they are in a foreign destination, just for logistical reasons, it will be the foreign law enforcement who would be responding, and those cases do tend to be more difficult. If it is a foreign carrier, then from the time the doors closed, for the boarding, until the door is open in the U.S. to allow the passenger to deplane. So if it's in the U.S., the FBI has jurisdiction. However, they don't have jurisdiction if it's a foreign carrier and the destination is a foreign airport.
Got it. So, but
hopefully
bottom
that
line,
helps.
we'll need to have local, federal law enforcement. The FBI would need to be aware of the U.S. attorneys, plus any local law enforcement in any jurisdiction that an airport exists. Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Okay. To move on, I think what I'm hearing is that with the deletion of the attempted behavior, there seems to be consensus from the ACPAC to keep the definition, again, with that modification of attempted behavior as proposed by the task force, and also the task force's recommendation, which is that airlines be encouraged to incorporate this definition in their manuals. Okay. The second recommendation, Chris, you mentioned about the encouraging law enforcement to responding to reported incidents, to be made aware of it. So that's also something, is that also something there's general agreement? We will need to talk about Mario's point of how would they become aware of it. Okay, great. Well, then
yes, we'll talk about that in the awareness section, right?
That's correct. Yeah. We'll talk about how to make them aware, but I'm presuming from the discussion here, there is consensus that to encourage law enforcement to be aware of it.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
We will move on to the next element of the report, which is the awareness campaign. Jessica, if you could present on that issue for us.
Okay, and at this point, we are going to talk about awareness. Can we see the PowerPoint?
Yes, you can see it.
Okay, great. The FAA Act states that airlines should have policies and procedures in place to inform personnel and passengers of their rights with respect to sexual misconduct. The task force determined that many passengers were not aware that sexual misconduct may be a crime and that it should be reported, that when an incident of sexual misconduct is not reported, the possibility of an effective response is limited. When airlines and law enforcement become more aware of the potential severity of these incidents, they are more equipped with appropriate response procedures when incidents occur. And it is vital to achieve better training, reporting, and data collection when passengers are informed about standards of behavior and know when and how to report an incident of in-flight sexual misconduct. Awareness campaigns are intended to deter offenders, advise passengers how to report incidents, and to inform victims of available resources and victim support services. The task force considered the FBI awareness campaign and possible awareness campaigns by airports, airlines, and government agencies. Some of the options that were discussed were in-flight announcements, information in the in-flight magazine or seat back pockets, posters or other signage, adopting and posting a passenger code of conduct, which would include the definition of sexual misconduct and criminal consequences, and posting resources or statements on websites or Wi-Fi landing pages. In its discussions, the task force recognized the challenges to awareness programs, but determined that these educational and awareness programs are vital to achieving better training, data collection, and reporting outcomes. The task force made one recommendation for awareness, which is that airlines, airports, and appropriate federal agencies engage in awareness campaigns by using the methods that best fit with their policies and practices on sexual misconduct. Federal agencies should take steps to raise awareness of how incidents involving in-flight sexual misconduct should be reported, and to ensure that passengers know these incidents are punishable under federal law and subject to penalties. And this concludes the presentation on awareness.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. So for awareness, as Jessica just stated, that the task force recommendation is for airlines, airports, and agencies to engage in awareness campaigns. Mario had raised just a few moments ago on what sort of awareness campaigns may be helpful. So I will open it up to the task force, to the ACPAC members to discuss the awareness recommendation.
Let me ask you a question. Is the awareness campaign, for example, when it says should engage in an awareness campaign, airports, should the airport engage in an awareness campaign to make the passengers and the customers aware? Or is it a campaign for the airports to be aware? Like I said, some of these airports are rather small and very, very, very tiny markets. And I think it would behoove everybody to have a campaign to make them aware and thus make the customers aware, for lack of a better term.
Right. Mario, that is an excellent point. The discussion, I was the DFO for the task force as well. The discussion during the task force in terms of awareness and airports was geared towards the airports making consumers aware of what is and is not sexual misconduct and what rights that they have, and to report such incidents. But your point is a valid one in that the airports need to also be aware of it in order to share that information with consumers.
I thought that was the case, but also keep in the back of your mind, because I was going to say not every airport is Atlanta. No airport is Atlanta. You know, you have airports that have one regional jet flight a day. So, and they have security, which are not quite LEOs. So, campaign to those airports, and thus the airports campaigning back to the customers may be a good idea.
So Mario, can I just ask a question? Is your recommendation related to the airport associations potentially raising awareness? I just want to understand what you're suggesting, and
No,
I think it looks like Patricia may want to say.
Actually thinking more of the FAA or the TSA pushing that mandate to airports and saying, look, you need to be aware of this and this is how you handle this. You know, most commercial service airports will know, but some commercial service airports, like I said before, have 1 or 2 regional jet flights a day, and they're very, very small. So it may be, you know, and some information, the information disseminated by the FAA may go a long way.
Patricia?
Yeah, I just have a question, and maybe this is more procedural, but it may help address this issue, Mario, that you're discussing. It's interesting that the recommendation talks about airlines, airports, and appropriate federal agencies, which I assume, you know, obviously FAA would be included in that, but then it goes into detail or more detail about, you know, how the airlines can implement it, and, you know, and how it best fits with the policies and practices. And then it says how the federal agencies should take steps and implement. So is there a reason, and maybe, I don't know, procedurally, or maybe Fran, with you having been in the discussions, why there wasn't sort of a carve out for airports as well? And I don't mean a carve out, I mean more specific direction where maybe airports and airlines both, you know, would use best practices according to, you know, how it fits their policies, because to Mario's point, you have different size airports, you have different practices. Is there a reason why airports specifically were not addressed?
No, I don't recall that. Perhaps Judy does, but my impression is the ones who would be preparing the information for consumers are more likely there would be sent to the airport through some of the agencies, through the FBI, through some of the airlines. So I think that perhaps it was a recognition of Mario's point that there were so many different sized airports with very small ones that they wouldn't have the manpower to implement an awareness campaign. But my recollection is that did not come up, and I don't know if Judy's still there. Yes,
It
perhaps
is.
you can respond.
Yeah, I don't think my
Sorry,
point.
it is on the report, just to clarify. If you look at page 19 of the task force report, there is a section on awareness campaigns by airports. And in that section of a report, it talks about a survey that was sent out to the airports to obtain information about how they currently inform consumers. And you will notice when you read that section that some airports inform consumers by putting information on their websites. There are airports that also put information on their website. I'm sorry, on posters.
Yes.
And also, Mario, for your point in terms of FAA or TSA, FBI has been active in this area. FBI has created posters, and they have sent it out to airports so that they could place those posters at different locations at the airport. So that is something that the task force also recognized and discussed.
Yeah, it's not so much the information to the customer, because you could always send posters and tell a small airport in Montana, please put these up. It's more along the lines of, if this happens, if you're contacted by an airliner and this happens in an airline, you should be aware that this is the definition and these are the procedures. Does that make sense?
Can I ask you to elaborate a little bit more, because you indicated, I don't know whether I'm just missing your point. I understand that what you are emphasizing is ensuring the airports are aware of these definitions and what can be done.
Exactly. The airports themselves are aware, and it's important, and have to be aware, so on and so forth. Because you could send a campaign to an airport and say, please put this on the checkpoint. And they'll put this on the checkpoint. They'll get a person from public affairs. If it's a small airport, they'll probably get some operations person. They'll put a little pamphlet. It may be beneficial to say, by the way, you're making customers aware, but your LEOs in the airport or whoever you use as LEOs should be aware of this also.
Okay, I understand. So Mario, in terms of ensuring that they are aware of it, you mentioned FAA or TSA. Are you envisioning meetings? How are you suggesting that particularly smaller airports become aware of this or are made aware of it?
It could be as simple as an FAA letter to every airport saying that this is what you need to be aware of. Please make your LEOs or whoever you use as LEOs aware of this. And most airports will say, we're already aware, thank you very much. Other airports will say, okay, well, just to keep it in the back of their mind. We don't want anything to slip by because, like I said before, we don't want anything to slip by because one airport has one RJ or regional jet landing every day. And most of their concerns is cutting the grass, keeping the grass,
Okay.
not so much the customers because it's 1 or 2 RJs a day.
Okay. So what are the members' thoughts on a proposal that Mario is putting forth, which is potentially having as a recommendation that a federal agency, whether it's FAA or someone else, probably FAA, since that's what Mario has said, send a letter to airports to make them aware of the work of the task force, the ACPAC, the definition, and so on?
This is Fran. I have a question for Mario. It would seem to me that the trade association, the Association of Airports, what is it called?
ACI.
Yeah,
And
would be
AAA, yeah, there's two, right?
Yeah, AAAE and ACI.
Would be the effective sources of that information. Don't they do education campaigns on other issues?
Yes.
This could fit very nicely, I would think, into one of their promotional activities rather than getting the federal government, FAA, which deals with a lot of critical issues, that this is a very important issue of awareness. But it seems to me that the trade groups could possibly do a more effective and faster job. What's your impression?
Fran, they do, both trade associations, AAA and ACI, do wonderful jobs. But not everybody is part of both associations. So it probably makes a lot of sense to have, that sort of dual approach. A letter from the FAA is going to hurt. It's just going to make people aware if they're not already aware. And having the associations put that out also in their newsletter, for example, isn't going to hurt. It's just going to make people more aware. If they're not aware, it'll make them aware. It's just to make an incremental move forward and make sure that everybody's completely aware of the ACPAC's work and what the benefits of the ACPAC works are.
May I suggest something? Mario, tell me what you think about this, just looking at the recommendation. Again, since we're working with these recommendations, and maybe we can enhance this slightly. And in the report, that is done then by DOT, perhaps, this can be included as an example in terms of a letter from FAA, so that we're not so prescriptive as to what the government needs to do. But could we not just say on the, I guess it's the last sentence, to say federal agencies should also take steps to ensure that passengers and airports are aware that acts of sexual misconduct, blah, blah, blah. I mean, should we not just say that? And then maybe, Blaine, in the report, in the final report, you can include that, or AG Carr, whoever's drafting it, can include that as a recommendation that, for example, it could be a letter from FAA, et cetera.
Yeah, and that's perfect. And I wasn't saying FAA, it's up to the secretary to figure out who's the proper organization to send whatever information needs to be sent. But I think that's perfect, Patricia. Thank you.
Okay. Fran and AG Carr, what are your thoughts on Patricia's modification to Mario's suggestion?
Good here.
Okay, thanks. Fran?
I have one question. It would read, federal agencies should also take steps to ensure that passengers and airports.
Right.
Now, we had talked about airlines, airports, and consumers. So aren't we leaving out the airlines in this?
No, the airlines are covered on the second page.
Right, yeah.
I mean, on second page, on the second sentence, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think what we're saying is that the airlines are going to devise methods that make sense
Recommended,
to fit their
yeah.
policies. And I mean, you could almost say also that it's the airlines and the airports will devise how you want to set up policies, right? Because that deals with your second part of your question, Mario, which is one is the airports being aware, the other one is the airport creating awareness to the passengers that are at the terminals, right? So we could modify the first sentence to say airlines and airports consider the methods mentioned in this chapter, and then the federal agencies should take steps to ensure that passengers and, because we are, I mean, we can say, airlines, passengers, and airports. Is that what you're suggesting, Fran? Federal agencies should also take steps to ensure that
Patricia,
airlines, passengers, and airports?
Well, that's what I was confused about, how that would fit in to that airlines, airports, and appropriate federal agencies should engage in awareness campaign. That's the first sentence. Now, that seems to encompass the last sentence as well, doesn't it?
Fran, I think you're correct in that the second part, which talks about federal agencies should also take steps to ensure that passengers, we talked about adding airports. It may be clearer to add airlines. It's presumed airlines know already by the second sentence about they will use different methods, but it doesn't explicitly include airlines. So it's up to the committee on whether you want to explicitly include airlines.
Yes.
That's fine. So
I would say that's fine.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I have now is there is agreement that federal agencies should take steps to ensure that passengers, airports, and airlines are aware of this area of in-flight sexual misconduct definition and so on. Can we go back a second on engaging an awareness campaign? Is there also agreement from the ACPAC for the task force recommendation, which is that airlines, airports, and appropriate federal agencies should engage in awareness campaigns?
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Okay, great. So we will do that one modification on the second recommendation.
Okay.
Okay, well then we will move on to the next area, which is reporting practices. Jessica?
Sorry about that. Okay, now we will move on to reporting. The FAA Act states that airlines should have policies and procedures in place to report incidents of sexual misconduct to law enforcement. It also required the task force to review airlines' current practices and protocols in responding to allegations of in-flight sexual misconduct. The task force was required to make recommendations based on a review of current airline practices and listen to first-hand accounts of passengers who have experienced sexual misconduct on board aircraft. The task force reviewed passenger complaints and examined the process of government reporting. It also surveyed airlines on current reporting practices and considered recommendations made by consumer rights organizations not on the task force. The task force learned that incidents of sexual misconduct may occur when it is difficult for passengers to report immediately, such as when the aircraft is descending and the flight attendants are in their seats. Individuals react to traumatizing events in different ways, and some may need time to process and will not report the incident right away. The task force considered various things with regards to reporting. They discussed and analyzed what airlines currently do, how flight attendants report the data and address privacy concerns, passengers who are not comfortable with reporting an incident or delayed reporting, and how other entities such as DOT and local law enforcement respond to allegations of reports of in-flight sexual misconduct. The task force made 5 recommendations for reporting. It recommends airlines to establish clear policies and procedures around reporting methods, so the airlines may accept and appropriately respond to reports of sexual misconduct, whether the incident occurs during the flight or after the aircraft has landed, and to disseminate the information as appropriate. Airlines have a procedure to identify and obtain contact information of the alleged offender and any witnesses to provide to law enforcement. Employees should be trained on policies and procedures of collecting this information. In order for airlines to better track the handling of sexual misconduct allegations, the task force recommends that airlines segregate sexual misconduct incidents in the airline records, such as documenting whether the incident involved a minor or whether law enforcement was requested. The task force recommends that airlines have a policy and procedures of informing law enforcement when incidents of sexual misconduct are reported to the airline, regardless of when the incident occurred. Policies may be developed in consultation with local law enforcement. Government entities should forward any complaints of in-flight sexual misconduct to the FBI. And that concludes the portion on reporting.
Thank you, Jessica. So a number of recommendations here. So 5 recommendations from the task force. Why don't we start with the first one?
I worked on design of the Iridium receiver.
Excuse me, can you please mute your phone? Oh, thank you. And also, if you are a participant and you're just joining us, please, mute your phone and turn your camera off. Thanks. So 5 recommendations, as Jessica mentioned. Why don't we start with the first one, which talks about the task force is recommending that airlines allow passengers or enable passengers to report incidents in various ways. Any thoughts on that? And part of this, just to give you a little bit of the history and what's in the report, is that, you know, from the firsthand experiences, unfortunately, that some passengers have had, and when we've heard directly from them, each of the passengers had different ways that they thought would be helpful to report the incident. There were some who thought that you know, maybe going to the back of the aircraft and talking. Others who would prefer to write something down. So there was not one uniform way that the task force could see from passengers on a preference on how to report it. So the task force came up with a recommendation that the airlines enable passengers to report incidents in various ways.
Hey Blaine, this is Chris. I have a question on maybe the history of why this was written in a particular way. When you look at it, it says establish guidelines, whether the airline learns of it on the aircraft or after the aircraft has landed. And maybe Fran can recall the reason that it was crafted that way. I asked that because my wife had an incident that occurred 2 years ago, and the incident began before the flight took off after they had been just seated. So is there a reason you don't say before the flight took off? It specifies after the flight landed?
So AG Card, I'm sorry, Fran, go ahead.
Some people do not feel uncomfortable on the plane reporting it. So they would wait till they deplaned and then report it perhaps to the customer service.
I see how. Okay.
But so I would think in the case of your wife, she got on a plane and the incident immediately took place. Is that the case?
Yeah, so they would have learned it on, I'd say, so after the aircraft landed, meaning after somebody gets off the plane.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So to that point then, I mean, do you need to have that language in there? Can you just simply say, to encompass all it's whenever a passenger reports it, right?
Yeah.
So to accept and appropriately respond to passenger reports of sexual misconduct, and then take out the rest and then disseminate the information as appropriate. Am I missing something? Isn't that what we want really in the end?
Can you repeat that, Patricia?
Sure. So then the sentence would read, hold on, let me go back. The task force encourages airlines to establish clear policies and procedures around reporting methods to enable the airline to accept and appropriately respond to passenger reports of sexual misconduct and disseminate the information as appropriate. And take out the words whether the airline learns it on the aircraft or after the aircraft has landed.
That might eliminate a fairly large number of passenger complaints, it seems to me. Because they may just automatically think, well, nothing was reported on the plane, so I don't have to worry about it. See what I mean? So after the aircraft has landed, do the customer service people, are they responsible for reporting it to the flight attendants or whatever? So I don't know. It seems to me that expands the purview of the airline, which is not necessarily bad. I don't know your view, Patricia.
I'm just simply, I mean, my view is that, if the policy should be, when you receive a passenger reporting of sexual misconduct, and how you disseminate it are the two elements. What do you do when you receive the information and how you disseminate it?
Well, yes, but just talking about airlines at this stage.
Yes.
It encourages airlines to do this, to respond and disseminate it. So if it goes, the person gets off, reports to law enforcement or reports to desk personnel at the airport, it might not necessarily get back to the airline in a very efficient way.
Patricia, just in terms of just background, this recommendation was intended to address two different points. One, and maybe if ACPAC breaks it down into accepting and appropriately responding as one, and then disseminating as a separate one, it may be easier. With regard to accepting the report and appropriately responding, the task force had heard from passengers, including some who came and provided firsthand experience and spoke with the task force, where she mentioned a reluctance on the part of airline employees to accept reports when the report was not made on the aircraft. And there were others as well who talked about reports were taken if the passenger reports it at the time, but not afterwards, and discussion from particularly organizations who are familiar with how individuals who may have been victims of sexual violence may react about freezing and not being able to report it until after the fact. So there was a lot of discussion at the task force on making clear that the report should be accepted, whether it is on the aircraft or later on, which is why that language was added. The second part of the task force's recommendation with regard to disseminating the information as appropriate also talks about in terms of the method of how can the passenger report this information to the airline. Should they use an iPad? Should they talk to the person? Should they write it?
Okay. I guess I don't see that that's written here, but I could be wrong. I mean, it seems accept and appropriately respond to passenger reports. That's what I was trying to do, is cover what AG Card talked about. It's like, what happens if you are, if it's before you're boarding, but you haven't landed yet. Now it's on the aircraft. So I guess, I mean, I think this is fine the way it's written. I mean, do you think, AG Card, this covers your concern with what you were talking about?
It does. With all due with respect to the drafters of the language, it seems like there might be a better way to do it, which is it's almost along the lines of regardless of the time, manner, or method that the airline learns of it. It's a little bit confusing. Like I said, after you landed, you do it once, but not before you take off. Again, there may just be a better way to put it. I think it covers it. I kind of where Patricia was going is appropriately respond to passenger reports of sexual misconduct, comma, regardless of the time, manner, or method that the airline receives the information. I mean, that seems like that covers whether you did it on the plane, off the plane, before, after, 2 weeks later, 2 hours later. Seems like that might cover a broader, but
I think that does capture it. I think what I'm hearing from the ACPAC members, so it would read, the task force encourages airlines to establish clear policies and procedures around reporting methods to enable airlines to accept and appropriately respond to passenger reports of sexual misconduct, comma, regardless of time, manner, or method that the airline receives
the report.
Receives the report.
Sounds good.
It clarifies it a little bit more.
Yes.
Okay, and then you're deleting the and disseminate the information as appropriate.
I wasn't doing that. I was just trying to take
Okay, good.
I was trying to take that one piece you and I were talking about.
Yeah, okay, good. I just want to make sure that was still in there. I mean, because obviously the disseminate the information as appropriate is one of the later recommendations, right? That talks about, it goes to the FBI, the authorities, what have you. So
yeah, I was trying to take that one piece.
So it's going to be a really long sentence, but I think that's the intent.
Okay, and we can make it 2 sentences to separate out the dissemination. But I think I understand in principle where the ACPAC would like to go.
Yes.
Okay, so the second recommendation from the task force on reporting deals with obtaining alleged offender and witness contact information. Any thoughts on that? And what the task force is recommending is that the airlines have a procedure to identify and obtain the contact information of the alleged offender and any witnesses. And just as a little bit of background, there was a lot of discussion at the task force, and it's in the report, on how the investigations really should be conducted by law enforcement officials and not airlines and not airline personnel. And really what law enforcement needs is just the contact information so that they can follow up as needed.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm here seeing nods. So is there agreement on this one, or anybody want to discuss this further? Okay. Okay, then we'll move on to.
And I'm going to I'm just curious again, and I think it's just from a procedural standpoint, just to throw a little bit of a monkey wrench in here. I'm curious as to, because the travel experience begins, from curb to curb, basically, from the time you get to the airport to the time that you land and leave. It seems like, all of this, and I understand because obviously this talks about, this whole task force is really about airlines, but I wonder, and maybe this is just more of an informational question, but what would happen? I mean, I guess if the report, Maria, was done at the airport, then you just forward it to the local authorities and you just follow procedures like you would for any kind of allegations of any kind of misconduct or any other inappropriate behavior, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, but we also know we have our own police force, and we also know we have to forward it to the FBI, and that gets investigated by the FBI, so on and so forth. What I'm talking about, and as long as the airline is very well trained, bigger airports are extremely well trained. But as long as the airline itself is well trained and can guide the law enforcement agency that responds, I think that would be fantastic.
Thank you. It's just more for background. I was curious.
I think that's basically solves the problem because, as long as your station manager in a far off sort of station could say, look, we have this report and you're supposed to follow these procedures, the LEO could say, okay, I get it.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So the third recommendation talks about segregating sexual misconduct incidents in airline records. Any thoughts on this? Chris, I see you shaking your head, meaning nothing to add?
Good here.
Okay, Fran?
No, as I think the recommendation is a good one, but it's I think the encouragement is important because so many the airlines have various ways of misconduct incidents of compiling them and reporting on them. So I think this encompasses that, allowing the flexibility.
Okay, so this is, I guess, three parts that I see in the recommendation. One is segregating sexual misconduct incidents. Second is encouraging airlines to identify whether the incident involved a minor. And thirdly, it's whether law enforcement has been contacted.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there is agreement on keeping this recommendation as is? Okay, great.
Yes.
The fourth recommendation addresses contacting law enforcement when incidents of sexual misconduct are reported. Anything additional or thoughts that the members may want to share with one another?
I have a question on this one. If the individual affirmatively says that they don't want to file a report, as my wife said she was not interested in filing, would that be irrespective of what the passenger said?
That's an excellent question, AG Carr, and there was a lot of discussion on this point at the task force and a lot of back and forth. Some of the airlines indicated during these discussions that for them, if the passenger explicitly indicates that he or she does not want to file a report, that law enforcement is not contacted under those circumstances. But there were also others who stressed the importance of this information being provided because there have been times when individuals have changed their minds, a week later, a few days later, and it's difficult to gather. If the information has not been gathered, then a lot of times it's essentially lost. So I do believe that the task force's recommendation is to contact law enforcement under all circumstances if there's been a report, but that does not mean the person would need to speak with law enforcement if they don't want to.
And would that be different between filing a police report versus reporting for data collection purposes, or was that not discussed?
So it would not. So the way the recommendation is written is that once an airline becomes aware of the incident, the airline would then report that incident to law enforcement. So whether law enforcement, the airline could obviously share with the law enforcement that the passenger did not want to file the report as well, because it's not the passenger filing the report. It is the airline that will be informing law enforcement that there was an incident.
Okay. And I ask because some police reports can be made public, and then that may make public if the individual's name is on there, and they may or may not want that to happen. But for reporting purposes, as far as data collection, I understand, and I'm not necessarily making a recommendation. I'm more asking kind of what the intent was. But I do think it's worth considering from a privacy perspective. If the individual does not want their name out there, it's one thing if it's in a police report that could be made public versus, reporting to the appropriate law enforcement for data collection purposes, which I think is important from a public policy perspective. That may be a distinction
and that may be a distinction or a clarification that the ACPAC may want to make. As I said, this was really discussed over several meetings with the task force. So this was not an easy recommendation. So if there are suggestions on how to modify those, I can note those as well.
I might just suggest that we make clear that if the individual has declined to notify law enforcement, and again, I don't know how to say this necessarily because I'm thinking this more now. I considered this before, but it might be that it's important to reach out to law enforcement for data collection purposes, respecting the privacy of a passenger who has declined to report to notify law enforcement themselves. Think about it, just more from a privacy of the individual perspective. And that's kind of clunky what I just said. So I open that up to others for modification.
AG Carr, can I ask a question in terms of your suggestion? My recollection, I'll go back and check on the report, is that the purpose of this was twofold. One was data collection, and the second was for investigation purposes. With regard to the investigation purposes, if the concern is privacy, is your suggestion that the person's name not be shared, or that the investigation not result from the report?
No, I'm just thinking about the privacy concern of the individual who's said that he or she does not want to doesn't want to file a police report, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not trying to.
Right, and I think
any criminal to be held accountable.
Right. Yeah, I think we need to keep this cleaner as well, because if we're instituting this across the board in terms of a policy decision, I think if we start getting into the granular level of, but this information, if this report is forwarded and the passenger information shouldn't be forwarded, then you start getting into a slippery slope where mistakes can be made. And so I think either the policy needs to be, or the recommendation needs to be, that, to AG Carr's point, either unless the passenger specifically requests that is not forwarded, or as a matter of practice, everything's going to be forwarded and the passenger has to know that that's going to be the case. If you're going to make a report, this will be sent to the authorities. So either the passenger needs to know in advance that it'll go, and that could be part of the airline policy when it's communicated that if you're filing a report, it will be submitted, and then just do it for everyone. Because I think once you start picking and choosing, it has unintended consequences. I think that's, but I understand where AG Carr is going for in terms of the privacy. So it might just be that we can put a carve out here that simply says, unless the passenger specifically requests that the report not be forwarded.
And I bring this up, we work a lot on addiction issues. We deal with human trafficking. You're looking at this, and we talked at the beginning of the report, this can be a traumatic experience for somebody. So I think it needs to be really survivor informed, and aware of that. Again, you don't want to re-traumatize somebody if they find out their name is now out in public. But again, I want criminals to be held accountable. I think it's awful and horrific when these experiences occur. I'm just trying to, trauma-informed services are important in these issues. And so again, that's where I was just kind of coming at it. And I don't want to gum up the works, but I don't want to re-traumatize somebody if they find out. And you don't want to chill somebody reporting to the airline if they know it's going to go public. They may be less inclined to do it. So, but I know the task force worked on this, and I think Patricia's right. I think you either need to do it and inform the passenger, or not do it at all. And I don't want to stop a criminal from being held accountable either.
No, that's a fair point, because there was a discussion at the task force about the individual who has gone through this experience having control of their lives and making decisions for themselves as well. I'm hearing 3 different proposals, and I want to just list what I've heard because I want to know where the ACPAC is. One possibility is the task force recommendation itself, which is that all incidents be reported to law enforcement, and we will double check, but that could potentially be used not only for data collection, but also investigation. The second proposal that I'm hearing is that it be reported to law enforcement, all be reported to law enforcement, but it only be reported for data collection if the individual, if the survivor indicates that they do not want their name to be forwarded. In that situation, it only be reported for data collection. And thirdly, I am hearing that maybe the awareness campaigns could include informing the passenger that reports would be submitted to law enforcement. So to the extent that there have been reports they're submitted, I'm sorry, that's the same as the first one. But lastly, that if somebody specifically says they don't want a report to be filed, that airlines would not submit those reports. So airlines submit everything. Airlines don't submit if the passenger says they don't want to be included. And airlines still submit, but only for data collection if a passenger says don't submit.
Let me ask you a question. Just in making sure that privacy concerns are kept in front of us, is it the airline's responsibility to make that determination, or is it law enforcement to make that determination? Shouldn't the airline just report, and then the law enforcement would come in and say, okay, well, you don't want to report, that's fine, we'll move on. You're putting the burden on the airline to make that determination whether it should be reported or not reported. I think it should be completely reported and let law enforcement make a determination whether it moves forward or not.
That is the recommendation of the task force, but AG Carr's point was also one that was discussed as well, which is how do you factor in the passenger's statement to the airline that they don't want it reported to law enforcement?
Yeah, I think.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine. No, because Chris, I totally understand where you're coming from. What I don't want to do is, it sounds like all of this was discussed by the task force, and at length. What I don't want to do is somehow undo or impose within 10 minutes of our discussion work that they have all done for a long time. There must be some reason for all this, and I think, if I remember correctly, I mean, the way the airlines are doing the policies and stating it is that it makes it clear that a report is filed, with the authorities. So in essence, the passenger who's making the report is giving consent for that information to be forwarded, and then the determination of whether that goes forward into an investigation or not, it's made by law enforcement. But this then allows, one of the issues that were discussed, and the purpose of the task force was to, how do we make sure that everything is accounted for, that all the reporting is accounted for? This will assure that data collection is there, so we check off that box of concern. And then there is some risk of privacy, but I think to the extent that the passenger knows that it will be forwarded to the authorities, then I think that we are, from a policy perspective, I think it would cover all of our concerns, I think. I could be wrong, but.
Nope, that's fair enough. And I think all things being considered, I would rather, again, somebody be held accountable and the data be collected. Just being aware of re-traumatizing a victim that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
I appreciate that. I appreciate y'all's consideration. I'm good. I'm good with the recommendation then.
Okay, so it looks like the task force recommendation is also one that the ACPAC would recommend, that airlines report all incidents of sexual misconduct to law enforcement.
Correct.
Yes. And the fifth recommendation in this area deals with government officials, whether it's local law enforcement, DOT, or others, also forwarding all complaints that they receive in this area to the FBI. And the DOT is doing this now. We do forward all complaints that we receive in this area to the FBI. Okay, great.
Agreed.
Okay, so that is included. Great. We will then move to the next discussion, which is data collection. Jessica?
Okay, and we'll be discussing data collection. In a joint statement of the 2018 Appropriations Act, Congress noted that there is limited data on the prevalence of incidents of sexual assault and harassment on board aircraft. The task force was charged with providing recommendations on best practices and protocols for airlines relating to data collection to enable a better understanding of the frequency and severity of this conduct. The task force considered existing government data, purposes and uses of data, existing airline data collection practices, methodologies to determine prevalence of such incidents. The task force focused on collecting data on incidents of sexual misconduct that protects the privacy and confidentiality of individuals involved and precludes the release of data that publicly identifies an individual airline to enable better understanding of the frequency and the severity of the misconduct. The task force made 4 recommendations for data collection. It recommends that all reported incidents of in-flight sexual misconduct that are made to the airlines, local law enforcement, airports, federal agencies, and other parties be referred to the FBI, and that the FBI maintain data on the number of incidents made. The task force learned that currently the FAA does not segregate reports of in-flight sexual misconduct. The task force recommends that the FAA review its complaint intake process to ensure that incidents of in-flight sexual assault can be identified. The task force recommends that airlines have a policy and procedures to identify the victim, alleged offender, and any witnesses, and to obtain their contact information to provide to law enforcement. It also recommends that airlines use the data from reported incidents of in-flight sexual misconduct to inform its training and policy development on in-flight sexual misconduct. It also encourages airlines to share their data, policies, and procedures with their regional partners. And this concludes the presentation on data collection.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jessica. So for data collection, the first recommendation concerns FBI maintaining data on the number of in-flight sexual misconduct incidents. You may recall from Judy's presentation earlier this morning about the lack of confidence on the numbers because not all of the incidents are reported to the FBI. So the recommendation here is that whether it is other governmental agencies, airlines, airports, local law enforcement, everyone report this information to the FBI. Is there agreement on this recommendation?
That's clear. Agreed.
Okay, great.
Agreed.
The next recommendation deals with the FAA, and I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I don't believe we spent time talking about what the FAA's role in this is. So just to familiarize some of the attendees, I suspect the ACPAC members already know this, but the FAA has the authority to issue civil penalties against offenders, and this is separate from the FBI's authority to pursue criminal action. And so the recommendation with regard to the FAA is saying that when the FAA receives complaints that the FAA segregate through its complaint process those that involve sexual assault. And actually, I'm saying assault for the FAA because the FAA authority under the statute is not for sexual misconduct, it's for sexual assault. So it is narrower than sexual misconduct. So if the FAA receives complaints on a variety of different issues, the recommendation here is that they segregate the complaints involving sexual assault. Is there any thoughts on that?
Nope, seems
Okay.
clear.
Looks like there's agreement on that one. The third recommendation concerns the task force encouraging airlines to have a policy and procedure to identify the victim, the alleged officer, and witnesses so that this can be provided to law enforcement for further action.
Yeah, I think you meant alleged offender, not officer, but.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to say.
That's okay. Just making sure
Catch it,
I have
so
the
alleged
latest version
offender.
of this, yeah.
Thanks.
There's a lot of that going on now, yeah.
So the alleged offender, the victim, and any witnesses.
Yes.
Okay. So thoughts, or is there general consensus on this?
Yes, it seems repetitive in a way, but yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Okay. And then the fourth recommendation here deals with the use of the data for airline training. And the recommendation is that airlines be encouraged to use the data on incidents of sexual misconduct that are reported to inform their training and policy development. Is there, okay, I see thumbs up from Patricia. Others, thumbs up. Okay, looks like there's agreement here. And that is it for data collection. So Jessica, we could hear from you one last time on training.
Okay, and the last section will be covering training. In the FAA Act, Congress noted that airline personnel should be trained to recognize and respond to incidents of in-flight sexual misconduct and to notify law enforcement. The task force was charged with making recommendations on how airlines should address and respond to incidents of in-flight sexual misconduct through training. The task force found that most airlines do not train employees specifically on handling incidents of sexual misconduct. The task force considered an airline survey of existing training practices, existing airline disability training programs required by DOT, training models from related industries such as cruise companies and hotels, and airlines that currently conduct sexual misconduct training. The task force considered who should be trained on handling incidents of in-flight sexual misconduct, how often, the content of the training, and how airlines can ensure the training is effective. The task force acknowledged the importance of trauma-informed training for communicating with individuals who have experienced in-flight sexual misconduct and having policies and procedures in place for responding to and reporting incidents. The task force made 2 recommendations for training. It recommends that airlines provide training on addressing in-flight sexual misconduct to flight attendants, pilots, and other personnel involved in responding to or reporting incidents of sexual misconduct. The task force agreed that the key elements of training should include the definition of sexual misconduct, sensitivity training, policies and procedures on responding to incidents of in-flight sexual misconduct, and the policies and procedures on reporting and data collection. And this concludes the presentation.
Thank you, Jessica. So training, first recommendation is training for flight attendants, pilots, and other personnel charged with or involved in responding to or reporting incidents of sexual misconduct. Just to give you a little bit of background, the reason the only 2 specific types of employees that are identified was flight attendants and pilots, and the other one is more general, is because through the task force work, it is not the same employees depending on the airline that are involved in these kinds of incidents, in addressing these kinds of incidents. So rather than identifying the positions, the task force thought it may be better to describe the types of employees who should be covered by this training. So anybody that is addressing how to respond, how to report, should have some form of training. So what are the ACPAC members' thoughts on this recommendation from the task force?
I'm in agreement. It looks good.
Okay, thanks, Mario. AG Carr?
Good here.
Okay, and I see thumbs up from the other two. Okay, so that's great. And then the other discussion and recommendation from the task force addresses what are the key elements of the training. And the task force is recommending that the airlines train on these key elements, which is starting with the definition of sexual misconduct, the sensitivity training, and this may be kind of victim informed, so you know how to ensure that you're not re-traumatizing the individual, and then policies and procedures on responding to in-flight sexual misconduct, and finally policies and procedures on reporting and data collection.
It's very clear.
Thorough.
Okay, I see nods, great. Okay, so it looks like there is agreement on that. And we're doing great on time. It is 12:37 and we are supposed to finish the discussion on training at 12:40, so exactly on time. 20 minutes is saved for summary and wrap up. So I am going to quickly recap what has been agreed to, and then I will open it up for, I'll ask Kim about who may have sent questions on this topic from the attendees. So starting with definitions, it looks like the ACPAC is agreeing with the definition with a slight modification that has been proposed. The modification that the ACPAC will be making is removing the phrase attempted behavior, so it's focused on actual behavior. With regard to awareness campaigns, there were two recommendations. The first recommendation, the task force is, the ACPAC is adopting the task force recommendation as is, which is that airlines, airports, and other appropriate federal agencies engage in awareness campaigns. It is modifying the second recommendation, which to add airlines and airports. So the modified second recommendation would be that federal agencies should also take steps to ensure that passengers, airports, and airlines are aware that acts of sexual misconduct are punishable by federal law and so on. And Mario's suggestion, which the ACPAC had agreed on, which is providing example of how federal agencies can make entities such as airports aware of this potentially by sending a letter. Reporting, so far agreement on, am I correctly recapping this? Okay. Yes. So with regard to reporting practices, it looks like there were 5 recommendations. Most of the recommendations are being adopted as is. With the first recommendation, there is a modification. This is a recommendation that deals with enabling passengers to report incidents in various ways. So this recommendation will now state the task force encourages airlines to establish clear policies and procedures around reporting methods to enable the airline, regardless of time, manner, and method that the airline receives the report. I'm sorry, let me backtrack again. The task force encourages airlines to establish clear policies and procedures around reporting methods to enable the airline to accept and appropriately respond to passenger reports of sexual misconduct, regardless of time, manner, or method that the airline receives the report. And then a separate sentence about the task force encouraging airlines to establish clear policies and procedures around disseminating the information.
Just a quick question on that, because I know we went around and around, but as I'm listening to it again, I just want to make sure. It's when it says regardless of time, manner, and method. So the first part of that is where the airlines are supposed to set up a policy for accepting the reports, right? So, but then I just want to make sure on the time and manner and method, obviously is on a time, manner, and method that it's in accordance to the policy itself, right? So
that's right.
Okay, good. And then the time, and AG Carr, maybe you can help me with this on the time issue. I imagine that the statute of limitations would apply on something like this, because what happens if a report, sorry about that.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that it would. But I mean, that would generally be I suspect, and not having it in front of me, it could be 2 years down the road, could be 4 years down the road.
Yeah, okay.
But I would presume that this fits into all other established statutes and statutory regimes as well. I think that the question, and that comes up to the policy. I think the question was, is it on the plane? Is it on the plane? Is it after it lands? Would it be a couple weeks down the road? That would be up to the policy.
Yep. Okay. I'm good with that.
Okay. And the idea here is for the airline not to have to make those determinations. Law enforcement can address those.
Right.
The second recommendation on reporting addresses a recommendation that airlines have a procedure to identify and obtain contact information of the alleged offender and any witness. So again, to assist law enforcement. So the airline's role here would be to obtain the contact information. The third recommendation for reporting concerns segregating the data. So the ACPAC would be encouraging airlines to ensure that any incident or report allows for the segregation of sexual misconduct incidents, whether the incident involved a minor, and whether law enforcement was requested. The fourth recommendation concerns, Fran, did you have a question?
No, I don't.
Okay.
My phone's overheating.
Yeah, no problem. And then the fourth one was contacting law enforcement when incidents of sexual misconduct are reported. And we did have a lengthy discussion, but I think where we landed is that the ACPAC would adopt the task force recommendation that law enforcement should be contacted if there is a report. Airlines will contact law enforcement. And finally, the recommendation was that the ACPAC would recommend that, local law enforcement, DOT, and others forward complaints to the FBI, sexual misconduct complaints. Last one, which is actually not last, data collection. There were several recommendations on here as well. The first one is FBI maintaining the data, so ensuring that all the parties, airlines, airports, governments send the information to the FBI. The second recommendation is to the FAA, which is the task force and now the ACPAC. The ACPAC would be recommending that the FAA review its complaint intake process and ensure that in-flight sexual misconduct can be identified. Thirdly, in terms of law enforcement referrals, the ACPAC is adopting the recommendation that airlines have a policy and procedure to identify the victim, alleged offender, and witness. This is similar to an earlier recommendation and provided to law enforcement. Two more recommendations on training. This one involves data for airline training program, and it's essentially that the information that the airline is collecting or on incidents of in-flight sexual misconduct, the data can be utilized to develop their training programs and for policy development. And lastly, maybe that was it. I think that was the last one. So that's the last recommendation that we have. So with that, I will, Kim, did we have any comments from any of the attendees? Since we do have a few minutes.
Yes, we do. We have one question right now from Bill McGee at Consumer Reports. I guess I should turn my camera off. Considering the FBI findings, did the members discuss the specific issue of children traveling apart from their parents or caregivers when families are separated on board? Will the task force recommend that airlines be prohibited from charging fees to sit children apart from family members?
So since Fran and I don't know whether Judy's on the line, were the ones who were here from the task force, I will start, Fran, let me know if you would like to add anything. There was a discussion during the task force meetings, and it's also in the report as well, about the impact on minors. And you will notice that one of the recommendations that the task force has made and the ACPAC discussed this morning and agreed to is being able to segregate data not only about sexual misconduct, but also whether minors were involved. So there was a lot of discussion about potential impact on minors. We did not have any discussion about, the task force did not have any discussion about fees. That was not raised by any of the task force members, as I recall. Fran?
Yes, we did have, in fact, some fairly extensive discussion on minors relating to, like, I question the use of one of the words in sexual misconduct, and the FBI pointed out, I objected to the word manipulation being included. And the FBI personnel who were involved pointed out that that particularly relates to children traveling without parents or adults, that is considered grooming, making friends with the child. So that's why manipulation was added, but to directly relate to children. So we did have a fairly extensive discussion on that.
And Judy, I don't know whether you are on the line. If you are, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think Judy signed off.
Okay, I think she may have had to go. Okay, Kim, any other questions?
Yes, we do have another question, and I just had to unmute myself, and so if you'll just give me a second here. I'm having too many things open on the screen, the problem we have with technology. Okay, so we've received a question from Paul Hudson at Flyers Rights. Flyers Rights and others have suggested that passengers and flight attendants be able to contact the FBI directly in a timely manner by phone, text, or email, or correspondence, and that the FBI have a dedicated place to receive such complaints or reports. What did the task force discuss and decide on this?
The task force's, recommendation and the discussion on this issue is in the report, including Paul. Thank you for coming and speaking to the task force. So that was helpful to have you there and hear your viewpoints. And there was a discussion on the recommendations Flyer Rights had made specifically at the task force. With regard to the FBI, one of the things that became apparent as the task force was deliberating on this issue was the importance of being able to have information right away. So the FBI explained to all of us that they are there when they can be. They're not at all locations. So if the FBI cannot be there, then there's local law enforcement who can follow up. And again, one of the other recommendations of both the task force and now the ACPAC is that airlines contact law enforcement for all reports of in-flight sexual misconduct so that law enforcement can follow up on these issues. Fran?
Yes, it seemed to me we did not discuss, we discussed the FBI's role. In fact, FBI personnel played a large role in some of the task force deliberations. But as a task force, it's my view that we do not have the authority to say the FBI has to set up this, the FBI do that, and the FBI. We don't have any authority, even in terms, we can recommend certain things, but that would be in conjunction, I think, with our overall role under DOT.
Kim, we probably have time for one or two more questions. Any other questions? And maybe see if there are questions. I'm happy to answer questions about the task force, but if there are questions for the ACPAC members as well.
Okay, so we do have one more question at this time. Charlie Leoka from Travelers United asks, does this task force and advisory committee believe that parents should pay extra to ensure they can sit next to minors?
So this is Blaine. There was not, as I mentioned earlier, there was not discussion at the task force on fees associated with sitting next to minors, and all of the deliberations of the ACPAC members are public. So as you know, this morning there really wasn't a discussion in terms of fees for minors. Unfortunately, one of the incidents that stick in my mind is hearing from a situation where there were minors that were assaulted on aircraft, and their parents were there. And I don't know, Fran, if you, I'm sure you remember this situation where the father was there and did not know it was occurring until afterwards. So it's, it's horrible that these kinds of things have to happen to anyone, but there have been incidents that we've learned of that have occurred even when the minor is not traveling on his or her own. So Kim, that's all the questions?
Yes, that's all the questions we've received.
Okay. Well, really appreciate the great work of the ACPAC members and your reviewing the report. It was very clear that you came very prepared today, and the really lively discussion and deliberation. So we will take an early lunch, so 7 minutes earlier than planned. And we will go back. We will come back and reconvene at 1 p.m. So I would suggest for the ACPAC members, you may want to just turn your camera off and mute yourself instead of logging back on. For the other attendees, I leave it up to you whether you want to just turn your camera off and mute, or you already have your camera off and you're already muted. If you just want to leave it on until 1 o'clock when we will reconvene. Okay, thank you. Enjoy lunch.
Blaine.
Thank you.
Thanks, Blaine.